Ah, Christmas. The perfect time of year to cozy up by the fire and enjoy the wholesome atmosphere of the season with a good book to keep you company. What screams Christmas like a book filled with eldritch abominations, nightmare realms, sadistic mind demons, and blood rituals? I really should have made this the October video. If y'all don't know, Gravity Falls stands as my favorite work of fiction ever. You could hear me rant about all of that in my top 10 cartoons video. Take a wild guess what number 1 is. Well, with that in mind, it might surprise you to hear that I really put off reading this book for a while. It came out this past July, and I only got my hands on it this November. You know, after all the hype died down. And then I still couldn't bring myself to read it until about 2 weeks ago. But I did it, so now we get to talk about it. I don't really have a great plan for how I'm going to structure this thing. I've never talked about a book on this channel before, so I'm just kind of writing what feels right and we'll see how it goes. Spoilers, by the way. Okay, so, first of all, if I'm such a big Gravity Falls fan, why did it take me so long to get around to this thing? I guess in the grand scheme of things, it didn't take me that long, but 5 months is an eternity in internet time. Well, to tell you the truth, I didn't know how to feel about the book existing for a while there. Gravity Falls ended back in February of 2016. I was there watching the finale live, and I bawled my eyes out. A few months later, Journal 3 was released, and I got that as soon as I could, read the whole thing, and bawled my eyes out again. 2 years later, the complete series disc set came out with exclusive creator commentaries, and I binge-watched all of them. Didn't cry that time, though. There were plenty of other books and merch that released in the midst of all that, but as far as my personal timeline experiencing the aftermath of the show's ending, I emotionally laid this show to rest 3 separate times across 2 years. That obsession I had with Gravity Falls stretching all the way from 2012 to 2018 had finally started petering out. I still go back to it all the time, but I had accepted it as this fully complete story that doesn't need any further exploration lest it risk tarnishing the incredibly satisfying ending. Then all of a sudden in 2024, everyone's talking about this new book. 6 years since I seriously thought about this show, and suddenly everyone's asking me, hey, have you read the Book of Bill yet? You're the biggest Gravity Falls fan I know, you have to have checked it out by now. Admittedly, I totally brought this upon myself. I'm constantly wearing my good old Dipper Pines hat, but it especially threw me off when a cast member at Disney World saw my hat and even they asked me if I had read the Book of Bill. A total stranger. And I don't know, I guess I just wasn't prepared to re-enter this world, to return to a headspace I haven't been in for 6 years, to let myself get all emotionally invested, to shed my tears once it's all over. Again. But that's all a little silly, right? It's just a book. One that I was guaranteed to really like, so I had no real reason to avoid it so much. Not to mention that it's all about Bill Cipher, not exactly the emotional linchpin of the show. You know what, let's actually talk about that. What's the point of a book told from the perspective of Bill Cipher? I feel like Bill's whole appeal as a villain is that he's this agent of chaos. He'll show up, be incredibly charismatic, throw in some cosmic horror, and make a shady Faustian bargain with you. Because he's a manipulative mind demon, he's able to be engaging from a character conflict standpoint as he exposes and challenges the inner struggles of our protagonists. But his own emotional journey or intrinsic motivation? There's not much there. We know that he's looking for a place to crash after his home dimension was destroyed, he needs a physical form, and he wants to party in the most horrific and weird fashion possible. That's all more than enough for him to work in the show itself. I'd say he's surprisingly effective given how little we know about him. And maybe that lack of knowledge is all part of the fun. He's probably not a top 5 villain for me though. Like, he's close, but only by virtue of being the villain from my favorite show. I tend to gravitate towards villains that are like a cracked mirror version of the protagonist. I'd give the Joker from Batman as an example, but YouTube video essays use this fucking guy so much, so Mr. Crocker from the Fairly OddParents. What happens when a god kid fails and has his fairies taken away? You get Mr. Crocker. Or hell, Emperor Bellos from the Owl House. Spoilers, mute for like 3 seconds. 2 humans enter the Boiling Isles, one embraces what makes it special, and one resents it. Ironically, Gideon is probably the better Gravity Falls villain by this metric. 2 kids discover the journals, one becomes better through that discovery, and the other becomes infinitely worse. Does this mean I like Gideon more than Bill? No, definitely not. Bill's just way too much fun. But I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that writing a Bill-focused book feels antithetical to what Bill Cipher is. A deep dive into his backstory, a look into his inner thoughts and feelings about the events of the show, a story structure with a strong emotional conclusion for the character. None of this really fits for Bill the way it obviously did for Ford and the other human characters with Journal 3. And that's the other tricky thing about the Book of Bill. It has to live up to Journal 3, a book that I absolutely adore. You go in expecting the book as seen in the show, pretty much just a bestiary of all the weird stuff in Gravity Falls, and yeah, it is that, but it's also written as Ford's daily journal, and through that format there's a very clear and interesting narrative being told. We get the earlier days of his research, the timeline of his relationships with Bill and Fiddleford, the deterioration of his psyche, Dipper's time with the book basically being a soft recap of the show, Ford's return and the recounting of his time spent in other dimensions, all culminating in the finale where in the aftermath of Weirdmageddon, the family drops the journals in the bottomless pit never to be seen again. It's such a fun read that I love going back to. I'd have to think it's impossible for the Book of Bill to ever live up to Journal 3 for me. But hey, maybe that's not a fair comparison. The Book of Bill is clearly working off of a wildly different premise, so I should meet it where it's at and stop stalling. What did I actually think of the book? Well, it's actually really similar to Journal 3, and I'd personally say that's a good thing. Just swap out bestiary with completely random and nonsensical weirdness. I guess it's also worth mentioning that this one's directed at older readers, which is like, sure. I guess it discusses death and morality in pretty frank ways that I wouldn't necessarily want a child reading, but it stays very much within the expected sense of humor of the show, which is certainly my preference. After all, this show's sense of humor is one of its strongest points, and it's absolutely the main selling point of the Book of Bill. It's hard to earnestly comment on or critique humor for me since I feel like it's so subjective, but if you liked the jokes in the show, the Book of Bill really cranks it up to 11 in the best way. Now, for as much fun as Bill Cipher is, there were only so many times I could get interested in whatever strange new entry he was throwing at me. That's what the extensive Bill's Guide to Everything section boils down to. An assortment of wacky topics Bill feels like discussing. And it's all good fun, certainly nice to hear the voice of this character jump out of the page after all this time, and the sheer variety of visual styles utilized for every page is incredible. But it's not really the good stuff. Because, much like Journal 3, there is an overarching narrative being told here despite the odd format. The story of the book is the constant questioning of how and why this book exists. If you somehow forgot, Bill died at the end of the show. So it's a worthwhile question to ask how exactly he's back to write this book. It's a question teased very early on and slowly built upon until you reach the end where all answers are revealed. Because of this, most of the entries leading up to that point come off as just Bill's big distractions, a cover to prevent you from noticing the truth behind what you're reading. That's a really fun way to go about telling a Bill story. What's less fun to me is the delving into Bill's backstory. Not that it was bad, but I do sort of scoff at the concept. If Bill's appeal is his weirdness, his madness, his unpredictability, walking through the misadventures of his life step by step does take away some of that mystique. Especially since a lot of what's told about his life really makes him out to be a lot dumber than usual. Let's walk through it a little. For starters, we get basically his origin story. I really like how this was handled. We get a little more detail about his homeworld and his place in it, and some heavy implications about what happened, but very little is explicitly stated, leaving the greater horror up to the reader's imagination. That's perfect. Give us more while still maintaining that mystique. That's how I'd want all aspects of Bill's story to be covered. But once we get into his time on Earth, we're told everything pretty directly. The extra info about the Henchmaniacs and Time Baby are all good fun. I also don't mind the stuff about the shaman from Gravity Falls. Love getting the lore of the Cipher Wheel fleshed out a bit, and I think never showing the shaman's face helps elevate the mystique of this whole segment. After that, we get a lot of little vignettes about Bill exploring different points in history while trying to get some sorry soul to build his portal. This is where Bill's string of failures becomes a bit much for me, though I appreciate the Pepperton Owl House references. It just becomes Bill trying to manipulate another wacky character before falling flat on his face over and over again. There are several parts during all this where they even take a break from Bill being the main narrative voice, pivoting to telling the story of the Anti-Cipher Society from their perspective. And look, I get it. Bill's a difficult voice to consistently write for 200 plus pages, and there's an extent to which I appreciate the shakeup. But I think it's telling that there had to be these breaks from Cipher. It's hard to carry a lot of narrative weight when your narrator laughs at the concept. It's even more telling that there's an extensive section of the book that just reverts back to the format of Journal 3, Ford's perspective and all. It's clear that this is the material that Alex Hirsch is more comfortable writing, and it shows because the missing journal pages is probably my favorite section of the book. settling back into Ford's mental state at the height of his isolation and madness, further exploring his relationships with Bill and Fiddleford, a weird little Christmas-themed story with a new creature entry in Krampus. I'm lucky that I coincidentally started reading this book as the holidays were approaching. I love Christmas, and I was always disappointed that Gravity Falls never shoehorned in some kind of Christmas special the way they did for Halloween. But this little Krampus story is a perfect consolation and gave me those warm holiday fuzzies at the exact right time of the year. See, it does make sense for this to be the Christmas video. So it's safe to say that up to this point, I've had some mixed feelings, but overall I was enjoying the read. It's made some choices that I didn't gel with, but has also had plenty of standout segments. Something I forgot to mention earlier were these excerpts about the cast's dreams that I really loved, particularly Mabel's and McGucket's. Bill talking about Mabel's fears like they're a tool to be used perfectly elevates that moment from Dipper and Mabel versus the Future, which was not out of character. Mabel made a mistake that was perfectly in character, which was why it was so effective and well done. And the brief passage about the cacophony of McGucket's psyche is always a tragically fascinating deep dive. But here we are, at pretty much the end of the book. This is where it totally sold me on it. Page after page after page of following Bill's chaotic whims, the random horrors, the tales of those whose lives he ruined. Now he offers us the chance to set him free once more, and who do we hear from? But Stanford Pines. Ford finally gives us the plain and simple truth of any attempt at analyzing Bill's character. He's just an egomaniac, begging for attention. But we don't just get to hear it from Ford, but Dipper, Mabel, and most importantly, Grunkle Stan. This is so notable because back in Journal 3, Stan was one of very few main characters to never write a section. Ford obviously wrote most of it, followed by Dipper. Mabel wrote a couple sections as well as Seuss, but never Stan. This is the first time I've heard this character speak since the finale. And when I say heard and speak, I know I'm talking about a book and really I'm just reading text on a page, but these characters all have such distinct narrative voices that I truly can hear them in my head as I read. And they're all talking to me just to say, hey, we're doing great, Bill has no power over us, and he has no power over you. This perfectly encapsulates my experience reading this book. Bill was never really the reason I was reading. I cared about the rest of the story. I cared about Gravity Falls, about Dipper and Mabel's struggles with growing up, Stan and Ford's broken relationship they want to repair, Seuss's found family, McGucket's recovery, Pacifica's independence. Bill was the one who would destroy all of that. Sure, he was fun, but he's never why I watched this show. When Bill asks if I'm really gonna pass up godhood because I care about these characters, it's a resounding yes. As Bill fades away yet again, my little lore itch gets scratched once again as we see the axolotl. Bill's backwards message in the finale was one of the last things I obsessively decoded back in the Gravity Falls heyday, and it was a final tease for Bill's eventual return by invoking the power of the axolotl. This isn't the first time we've seen the axolotl. There was a non-canon Choose Your Own Adventure book that briefly showed him, but for me, this might as well have been the first time. Finally paying off that hidden tease in the finale and confirming Bill's ultimate fate. I won't spoil that myself, since it's probably the funniest part of the whole book, and concludes that overarching narrative of questioning this book's very existence. If you couldn't tell by now, I highly recommend the Book of Bill, and if you're somehow watching this before reading the book yourself, I think you deserve to at least have the very end be a total surprise. I will admit, I don't like it nearly as much as Journal 3 or the show proper, obviously, but that Stan page did get me a little teary-eyed. I'm just such a big baby when it comes to Gravity Falls. And you know, I don't feel nearly as sad about leaving it behind as I did when the show ended, or when I finished Journal 3, or when I got through the disc set commentaries. After so long, this felt more like a nice little check-in. Confirmation that my favorite characters are still kicking, better than ever. It's funny how animated characters are immortal, huh? You can say that about most fiction, but animation especially is such a distinct collaboration between writer, artist, animator, and voice actor that takes on a life all its own. In the same way that Mickey Mouse, Bugs Bunny, Scooby-Doo, or the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles are always going to be around in some form, I take comfort in the idea that the Pines are never really gone. We always have a chance to check in and see that they're all still okay. That sentiment makes it sound like I want a reboot or sequel series of some sort. No, don't do that. But I look forward to 8 years from now when Alex Hirsch somehow realizes another random idea for this cast, and we get to check in on them all again. Well, this video got a lot sappier than I expected it to. That's just what happens when I talk about this show. It means so much more to me than I can realistically express. But in any case, I appreciate you all for watching. This has been a fun year for me as far as the channel is concerned. I set an arbitrary goal for myself at the start of the year to try and get one video out a month. With this, I've managed 12 major videos this year, even if some months had to pick up the slack of others, so I'm proud of myself for that. I imagine I'm gonna slow down a bit next year, which is probably insane to say when plenty of YouTube channels are running on weekly uploads, but yeah, I could never do that. But I promise you this, I am holding myself to making that DuckTales episode ranking next year. I've been talking about it since the top 10 cartoons video. I ended up ranking the Owl House episodes this year instead, but I promise I will do DuckTales at some point in 2025. So look forward to that. And of course, Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays. See y'all next time.